But I'm going to suggest that is the question that a lot of people were asking. So here's the question. What is the significance of 2024? So like I said, no one asked this question. Some of the questions that people ask that I'm relating to this are the following. What do you mean that the repeating pattern is no longer fit for purpose? What are we to use if not the repeating pattern anymore? What about the death decree and the time for the second advent? Is that not helpful anymore as well? And a few others. And I think all of them are related to one fundamental question. Why was 2024 so important? What did it change? And that's what I want to explore with you today. So I'll begin by saying, whether you call it unsealing, increase of knowledge, formalization, and test, or you call it Boston, Concord, Exeter, and shut door, or you call it close of probation, death decree, I'll just call it time for the second advent. And then the second advent. These are all the same pattern. So what applies to one applies to all. And I think this is what was taught in the past. If we have our 5 waymarks and our 4 dispensations, we would have 2 waymarks in between each dispensation. And and we knew that they shared similar characteristics, even though their emphases could be different. And we ended up just calling them all Boston Concord Exited Shut Door, recognizing that it's the same pattern. So this is to answer the first bit of one of the questions, that when I'm talking about the repeating pattern, I'm talking about all the different ways that it can be represented. So I want to look into why I think it's not a helpful model anymore. And how we're going to do this is by going back to the study of the covenants, which we've been looking at. So I've mentioned before that ancient Israel is our primary template for understanding these covenants. And the reason for this is that it's the only, Israel is the only nation that has a complete documentation of their covenant relationship with God. The story of Adventism was still being written, still happening. And so is the story of humanity as a whole. These two are not historical accounts that we can use. But Israel is a historical account that we can use. And so we're using it. So Paul explains in Galatians 3 that ancient Israel was given the law at Sinai. And he asked the question why. Why was this law given? And by the law, he means the old covenant. when God had promised to Abraham the new covenant? And the answer that Paul gives is that it's because of transgressions. And I've tried to explain what this word means in the context. It's not about individual people doing bad things. It's about how Israel thinks, how they view the world. And their worldview is a creation of the world in which they live. So Paul was saying that God had to give them this old covenant system because of their worldview and because of the world in which they lived. This was very limiting. It was going to be difficult. I would say impossible. So it was going to be impossible for Israel to have a clear understanding of God. Or of the relationship that God wanted to have with them. So I'll just say limiting in their ability to understand. And God understood that. And I've said before, and I'll say again, that the Old Covenant simply means a limited understanding of the law, the limited understanding of God. And the New Covenant is a complete understanding. But it's the same law, same God. They'll be explained differently. So here there's the use of many temporary examples. And then here there's the extraction of the principles. But it's the same law, same God. So it's the law of equal rights. So another thing that Paul explains is that this old covenant system was the only way that Israel could be free to do their work. The work that they were given in the plan of salvation. That work was to prepare for the coming of Christ and for the coming of Christianity. Because Christ and Christianity were going to continue the work of the plan of salvation from that point onwards. So from Sinai, Israel was supposed to grow in their understanding of the law. And by the time they got here, AD 34, they, they were supposed to be mature. And once they were mature, they were not going to need the old covenant system anymore because it would have done its work. And its work was to take care of them when they were young. The new covenant is not for children, it's for adults. Because only adults are capable of complete understanding of things. So we can conclude the same thing for Adventism. We know Adventism was raised up between 1798 and 1844. This is when our foundational messages were given. You can think of the 1843 Charter as a symbol of that. Our prophetic understanding. So Adventism was raised up to explain the end of the world, to prepare the world for the end, for the second advent of Christ. But there was a problem. Adventism didn't understand the end of the world very well. And if you ask why, like Paul did, hopefully you can recognize, like Paul did, that it was also because of transgressions. Transgressions of the 1260. And what this is the worldview. Early Adventists had a Christian worldview. Impacted by the world in which they lived, or rather created by the world in which they lived. I think it's a little worse with modern Israel or Adventism, because geographically, Adventism lived in what Ellen White calls the New World. America. But they still saw the world the way it had existed in Europe. The old world. So their bodies were here, but their spirits or their minds were here. They were preoccupied with church and state. The papacy. Islam, and so on and so forth. And they saw these entities or players and this way of governing the world as explaining or characterizing how the world was going to end. they still thought in the language and spirit of kings and priests instead of presidents and political parties. I'm not making these equivalent. I'm just identifying some of the things that changed. They did not make the mental shift. And they couldn't make the mental shift because, at least I think, most of the people around the Millerites, around Adventism, also hadn't made the mental shift. Which is why after you after the end of the Civil War, you've got this push in America to recognize the nation as a Christian nation, to enforce Christian principles. Including Sunday laws. So God understood this, and I'm saying because of this, God gave them the old covenant, which for educational purposes I'll call a limited understanding of the end of the world. And just like with ancient Israel, that limited understanding was codified. That limited, yeah, that limited understanding was codified. So you've got the 43 and 50 charts, and you've got the writings of the spirit of prophecy. Both speak about the end of the world, and both give a Christian version of the end. What do I mean by Christian version? So I already mentioned how government would work or set up. Kings passed laws to get things done, and they expected the end of the world to be driven by laws. Particularly Sunday laws. Catholic priests promoted Sunday worship, so they were going to influence the kings to pass those laws. Except that it wasn't Catholic priests, it was Protestant ministers now. But the model remained the same. The target of, I'll just call it persecution, was a specific group of Christians. Christians that kept the seventh day Sabbath. Christians that didn't like the papacy. There was no place for China in that model, as an example. No place for India. The story focused on Christendom. What I hope you'll be able to see already is that if we have the world here, so this is the planet. I'll just say most of the planet is Christian, but you've got other groups as well. You've got Buddhists, you've got Hindus, you've got atheists, and more. A Christian version of the end doesn't account for atheists, except to say they're all in darkness. They're all sinners. They're wicked. They are our enemies. I just want you to see that this is not in agreement with the concept of equality under the law. Because equality under the law states, or what it means, everyone, and this is the most important word, everyone is viewed and treated the same by the law. A Christian version of the end can't do that. People are not viewed the same. Christians are friends. Everyone else is your enemy. They don't even matter. They're not discussed in prophecy at all. So if China rises up and becomes this powerful nation, that actually changes our world, we don't care. They're not part of our model. They're not part of Christendom. And therefore, they contribute nothing to the story of the end of the world. That to me is a limited understanding of the end of the world. And it's what I'm calling in my studies the old covenant of Adventism. And I'm not saying it was bad. Just like the old covenant with ancient Israel was not bad. It was necessary because that's all they could understand at the time. And like ancient Israel, Adventism also had to grow. In preparation for the raising up of this movement, and the changes that would take place when the Sunday law was fulfilled. Here, there would be a mature system of prophetic interpretation. One that is more global, universal. that is able to account for the things that are happening all over the world. So in AD 34, the change was from a Jewish worldview to a universal worldview. We know this is when the stoning of Stephen happened. The conversion of Saul, and the first Gentile converts to Christianity. The Jewish system was not going to work anymore in the plan of salvation. And here the disciples had to change. Their understanding of a Jewish Messiah into one of a universal Messiah. So even though they had accepted Jesus, the disciples still saw Jesus as a Messiah for the Jews. And they had to move away from that understanding. The events of 34 AD forced them to shift from that understanding. An example is Peter's dream to kill and eat the animals that were in a sheet. And he was told, do not call unclean what God has made clean. And Peter understood that this was referring to the Gentiles. So they were beginning to recognize, oh, Jesus was the Messiah for everybody. And if the Messiah was for everybody, it means the kingdom that the Messiah was setting up was for everybody. So you have a universal Messiah and a universal kingdom. Not a Jewish Messiah and not a Jewish kingdom. Of course, this was still limited because their understanding of universal stretched only as far as the Roman world extended. Yeah. So universal to the early Christians was the Roman world. And that was limiting in some ways. One major way in which it was limiting is that of all ancient empires, the Roman Empire was known to have the most slaves. Slavery was at its height in the ancient world. Under the Roman Empire. And we know that slavery is not equality. So that would definitely impact how far the Christians or apostles could understand equality. So we come to Adventism. And Adventism has a similar experience. And we have been part of Adventism as this movement. We've had an Adventist slash Christian understanding of the end of the world. A worldview given to us by our mediator, Ellen G. White. And therefore, what we foresaw being set up is an Adventist or Christian kingdom. Not a universal one. But the Sunday law becomes a very important, a major theological turning point. And we know this is 2024. So when you look at the Jews, back to the Jews, in order to move on to the next stage or next level of their work, it became necessary for the Jewish ideas and institutions to be set aside. And new ones take their place. Ideas and institutions that made the Jews believe they were separate and superior to everyone else. They had to be set aside. And they needed ideas and institutions that would reinforce the idea that they were equals with the Gentiles. Equal under law. Similarly, the Sunday law, which is we've always taught is the modern version of AD 34, marked the point where it became necessary in order to progress to the next level of our work. It became necessary to set aside the ideas and institutions that made us believe we were separate and superior to everyone else. This can be summarized as our Christian version of the end of the world. That entire Christian framework became unfit for purpose at the Sunday law. And I hope we will individually take time to try and understand why that is. Why a Christian way of looking at the world is not going to help anything. It's just not the reality. Kings and priests don't dominate our world today. Christianity is not trying to enforce Sunday laws. Sabbath keepers are not targets of persecution. And these are just simple examples. There are many more that we could talk about. Evangelism is an example. It's not it's not as successful as it was in the days of Peter and Paul. People are increasingly becoming wary of being proselytized. Some are either Christian by name and they don't go to church. Others are not Christian at all. Christianity has been declining in its influence since 1798. We might not have recognized that, but the moral majority did, which is why they tried to recapture government under the Reagan years. And even that wasn't very successful. They've tried under Trump, and we shouldn't be deceived by the seeming success of Project 2025 and some of the Christian aims there. It really doesn't say anything about the influence that Christianity has. If you compare it to the influence it had during the 1260 and before. It is no longer the dominant mode of thought in society. And I think we would do well to recognize that. So when we come and say an Adventist or Christian version of the end of the world doesn't work, it shouldn't come as a surprise. We can either accept it and see what changes are taking place, the direction that the plan of salvation is going, or we can deny it and, like the Christian right, try and force a revival of Christian ideas and Christian ideals. And a Christian version of the end of the world. But it won't help. So moving on with 2024 as this turning point. It's not only because AD 34 typified 2024, but it's because in 2024, there was a theological shift in this movement. And what that theological shift was can be summarized in the studies that were done in 2024 on QFMG. So what these studies did is they shifted our focus. So I'll just put 2024 as the demarcation. This is not 100% accurate. I'm just trying to keep it simple. So our focus of the end of the world before the QFMG studies was legislation. So we framed the end of the world in terms of legislation. I think I'm having a challenge hearing my translator now. Do I just change channels?
Yes, Blessing, you can just change it. Just choose any language that you want.
Okay. Okay, I'll just test. I chose the German. So the focus was on legislation. Hmm. Sorry, perhaps the problem is on my end. Um,
German
could
is
I,
translating you, so I guess there's something on
yeah,
your
could
end.
could I just have a moment?
Yes, of course.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but your camera is still off.
Yeah, I think it's still weak. I tried to change the connection, but it's still breaking up on my end.
If your camera doesn't go on, it's no problem if you want to continue like that. Just make sure you hear a translator.
Hello, testing.
We can hear you again. We just don't see.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds better on my end as
Okay.
well. Okay, sorry
Okay.
about that.
Now we see you. Just choose a language and see if you can still hear your translation. Okay.
Yeah, I've chosen the German, I think.
Okay.
Um, so I was now trying to discuss a bit more about how 2024 represented a shift. And I said before 2024, and what I mean is before those studies went public, our focus was on legislation. So initially we said Sunday legislation, then we moved to gender legislation. There was still an expectation that an act would be passed. If you could remember the studies done by Elder Tess in 2021, I think one of them was titled Homage Through Hatred. Like worship through hatred. America was going to worship the papacy. Um, I'll just take that again. Amer America was going to worship the papacy unwillingly. And how America was going to worship the papacy was through the passage of an act or a law. So what we did is we changed the issue or the subject. We changed the subject from worship to sexism. But it was still focused on legislation. The QFMG studies shifted that focus completely. We started focusing on political ideas about world order. Because once you talk about the RNC, what the RNC is about is political ideas. So America has these national conventions during their presidential election years. And these conventions represent a summary of the ideas that the party stands for. Basically, an indication of what that party is promising to America. And because we live in a universal world, a global world, not an American one or a Christian one, what the party promises to America will have implications on the wider world. Because as we know in the world we live in, things are globalized. So when we shifted from law to political ideas, as drivers of social change or social order, this change shattered our Christian way of understanding and explaining the world. Because Ellen White read the Bible, and the Bible said, when a king wanted to change the world, what they did is they passed a decree. So they pass a decree or a law. And this would change the world. Yet this all-powerful entity that would change things. This is the old world. In the new world, things are more complicated. Power is distributed to different entities. And the way you get things done is political process. You compromise, you build coalitions. This is how you effect change. In the new world. And so we had to shift from expecting Congress to pass a law or a president to pass an executive order and say, that's the Sunday law. It's far more fundamental and far more uh, comprehensive. It's far-reaching. It's more far-reaching than a piece of legislation. It's about changing how the world operates, how the world is organized. So it's never been about a specific law. It's always been about world order. And if you look at what I think was the major or most important promise of the RNC of 2024, it was to destroy the liberal international order. I think that was the most significant thing we were supposed to see. In 2024. And that's what the Sunday law always represented or symbolized. It was never about a law. It was about changing how American society worked. And by extension, how the rest of the world worked. So what happened in 2024 is we moved from the example to the principle. And this should have indicated to us that our Christian way of explaining the world is no longer helpful. It had done its part. So replacing worship with sexism was a step forward, but it wasn't enough because we still expected legislation, which is how the old world changed things. Decrees were the main drivers of change. Another problem is that sexism, I'll say, was when understood in a certain way, was focused on women's rights. And if not handled properly, it ends up being the same problem as the worship one. So in the worship one, the worship model, the thinking was the kingdom is for Christians, Sabbath keepers. So it ends up focusing on Sabbath keepers. And ends up not explaining or accounting for everyone else. Sexism as a prophetic model had the same issue. It ends up it ends up focusing on women and women's rights only. So we would end up just looking at events that relate to women. Maybe an abortion law, or a law about LGBTQ. Sorry, just having a technical issue. Is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay. So we know that Elder Tess introduced us to this concept of feminism. And the opposite of feminism, say, is patriarchy. We know that patriarchy is not just about men. It's 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 about men. Patriarchy is actually a contract between men and women about how they will interact with one another and how they will run the world. So feminism, if compared with patriarchy, has to be the same thing. It's a social contract between men and women about how they interact and how the world is going to run. So this is not anything new. This is something that's been taught in the movement for a while. So if I'm to borrow a term from Elder Paminda, another way to look at patriarchy is the war international order. And another way to look at feminism is the liberal international order. Living together in peace. So my point in all of this is to say we were shifting from systems or models that focused on parts of society the Christian model, sexist model, to ones that address and account for all of society. So we shifted to a universal political and prophetic model. Whether you call it equal rights under the law, you identify the Republican Party's intention to destroy the LIO. It's just it's just different ways of looking at the same thing. So we will pick up this discussion from this point tomorrow. Let's pray. Dear God in heaven, we're grateful that we can live in a time where we can have a complete understanding of the law and a complete understanding of the end of this world. Amen.
presentation. And thank you all for joining us. The next presentation will be tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock UK time. And that'll be with Curtis. I wish you all a very good night. Good night.